Thank you for coming out in such large numbers, no pressure at all, not intimidating to see this big crowd. I do hope all of you in time will get a little space to sit down. Just keep the middle corridor open if possible. We do have a tall ask. We have exactly 45 minutes in which to talk about a subject that the world is really grappling with, for both the right questions to ask as well as the answers. In a sense, on October 7th in 2023, the world witnessed attacks that were seen as a game changer in the country, in Israel. For the rest of the world, we received then a new lexicon for brutality, not just on October 7th, but each of the 120 days that followed. We've seen everyone from small babies to senior citizens being killed senselessly, without particular reason, it would seem. Unsuspecting motorists killed on one side, teenagers at a music concert on another, hospitals, universities, schools, all of them leading to a death toll that is already crossing 25,000. And closer to 30,000, I think, at the time we speak, from both sides. I say this because as a journalist, you're used to seeing a lot, and we have journalists on our panel today who also have, in a sense, personalized a lot of the visuals they've seen over the last few months. But it does seem as if there's something going on that is new. To hear the UN Secretary General speak about an area as a graveyard for children because of the daily bombardment. The idea that journalists have been killed in large numbers, but also UN workers, healthcare professionals, almost as if they're being targeted too, being killed. And the grievous sense of hurt that you deal with when you're speaking to both sides. Now, our authors today have actually witnessed that kind of deep sense of hurt on both sides for decades. Maybe many of us are coming to terms with it just over the past few months. But what it seems like is a lot of the loss of hope that things can actually change. One of Israel's biggest leaders, Shimon Peres, has written extensively about his ideas for peace. And eventually, he came down to a basic question, which I think is true for so many countries around the world. You're going to have to choose between being built on an ideology and being built on an ideology of democracy. In other words, those are the choices that I think everyone is looking at, thinking of how we can perhaps redistribute the land to make it more equitable, or what other solutions could be. So that's what we're going to try and get around to first. But I do want to start by asking each of you, is October 7th quite the game changer? Do you think the world has changed since then in the way it looks at the Israel-Palestine crisis? And do you think people inside Israel and Palestine are actually seeing this as the moment where everything can be, before this and after this? Or is it actually just much more of the same of what you have witnessed over decades, or read about, or written about? We could start with you, Antony.
It's a game changer. And what I mean by that is, we have seen in the last 5 months the greatest amount of Palestinians killed and displaced in their history, ever. More so than 1948, which obviously was the establishment of Israel. Alone, that fact is shocking and outrageous and unforgivable. We have seen much of the Western world come 110% support for Israel, and yet despite that, there is a disconnect between the political leaders in many Western countries and their people. And what I mean by that is that in so many places around the world, in the US, in parts of Europe, even in Australia, my home country, you see not just massive protests, but to the point where, as one example, 2 weeks ago there was a poll in America that found that 1/3 of American voters thought Israel was committing genocide in Gaza. 1/2 were between 18 to 35. That is a trend that existed before October 7 in terms of what Israel was doing in Palestine, but it is shifting. And I say that because I think there is a growing wake-up call amongst many places that, and I say this not just my own opinion, I say this as someone who's Jewish myself, although not religious, that Israel for decades has never wanted true peace with Palestinians. There has been no incentive or pressure on them to do so. And here we are in 2024, and we still have so-called leaders like Biden and Europe talking about, let's see how we can establish a two-state solution. It's over. Now, what I mean by over is that there will not be an equal division of the land. Israel has a choice. It has chosen for decades. It's one state. It's an apartheid state that oppresses Palestinians. And that's just not my view. That's reflected by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and various other organisations. The only other alternative is one democratic state, which allows all citizens to live Jewish, Muslim, Christian, atheist, whatever. Israel does not want that. And I think I think for many people since October 7 around the world, there's been a growing realisation that Israeli society itself, despite the horrific, undeniably brutal attacks of October 7 by Hamas, Israeli society itself has become radicalised for years. There is no constituency in Israel for true democracy. It does not exist. There are Israeli Jews, of course, who are opposed to what's happening. They're a minority. And just finally, when you have a majority of Israeli Jews who are polled before October 7 and since, that they support the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, that's Israeli Jews saying they want that, we have a problem with radicalisation inside the Jewish Israeli community.
Sure. Certainly, as a journalist, I do have to position the counter, because of course what you say now has been opened up by Prime Minister Netanyahu himself when he said, I really don't believe there is a two-state solution possible. Of course, the Israeli position for years has been that the Palestinians haven't really moved the talks process forward. I want to come quickly to you, Navtej, as well, as someone looking in from here and someone who's known Israel both spiritually as well as a diplomat. Do you think October 7th has in fact fundamentally changed the nature of the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Thank you very much, Suhasini. I wouldn't say that it has changed fundamentally the nature of the conflict. The conflict remains the same, which it has for at least 100 years or more, if you go back only to the Balfour Declaration. It's a conflict for land. It's a conflict of two people trying to be in the same land, and how much will each have? So, there is the old story of the Zionists sending rabbis from Vienna to look at the land, and the rabbis came back and said, the bride is beautiful, but she's married to another man. And, this has not changed, and what has changed is who will get whom according to which plan. Now, what has changed on October 7 is three or four things. One is that Israel's sense of security that had been built up over the last 75 years, its sense of superior strength, first-rate intelligence, top-class defense, that has been shattered. And when it has been shattered, it has shattered the psyche of the Israeli people. And no longer, I think for a very long time, will Israelis feel that they have a homeland where they can sleep peacefully. Now that is going to have long-term ramifications. The second thing that has changed is that the flag of Palestinian resistance, rightly or wrongly, has been taken up by Hamas and given a very violent face. Now, it's not that it has happened for the first time. Violence has happened there during the Intifadas. Violence happened at the time of PLO. But I think the scale of the October violence has been quite remarkable. And quite remarkable has been the Israeli sense of vengeance after this. And, as President Biden said very early on, there is no returning to the status quo. So it's going to be very difficult to say that nothing has changed. One other thing that has really changed is, there was a narrative being built up, there was a process in the pipeline of Israel slowly becoming normalized, quote unquote, within the Arab world, more diplomatic relations all across the globe. Now, I think it is going to be very difficult to get that back on the rails again, if at all. So these are some of the things that have definitely
that you
changed.
think have changed. Charles Glass, if you could just respond to that as well. You've just come from Lebanon. You've covered the region beyond the modern day boundaries, in a sense, when you write about the tribes of the region as well. How much do you think October 7th has really changed things, or just adding more wound to previous wounds and hardened positions further?
I believe that the Israeli operation in Gaza from October the 8th was the acceleration of a process that has been underway since the beginning of the Zionist settlement of Palestine. The goal has always been, as Edward Said wrote, more land, fewer Arabs. For the last 20 years, they've been strangling the Palestinians so that many, particularly educated ones, have to leave to survive. Now they're actually physically driving them out in large numbers, the way they did in 1948 when they expelled 3/4 of the population. So to me, the process is the same. It's just more dramatic, more sudden, quicker, and they're discussing even now bringing settlers back to Gaza in the areas that the Israeli army has cleared and bulldozed the houses. As they bulldozed, by the way, after 1948, 385 Palestinian villages, which were wiped off the map. Gaza is being wiped off the map. That is the goal, so that the Israelis will be able to control all of historic Palestine, Israel, whichever you want to call it. And so I don't think it's such a big difference. It's just a much more dramatic and obvious operation whose goal isn't simply to make Hamas suffer for what it did on October the 7th. If that were the case, they would target Hamas, but they're not. They've targeted all of the people of Gaza. Most of the people of Gaza have nowhere to live. Most of the people of Gaza don't have enough water to drink. They don't have electricity. They don't have hospitals that function. Children are dying because they're bleeding to death. This is not going after an organization. This is going after a people. And a people, by the way, who have always been the object of Israeli colonization, is to get rid of those people. I mean, if you talk about a solution for Palestine, Israel, you have to ask yourself, if you're going to have a solution, what's the problem? Okay, I mean, in Britain, we had a solution called Brexit, for which there was no problem. In Israel, Palestine, okay, there's a problem, but what is the problem? Okay, to the Palestinians, the Israelis are the problem. To the Israelis, the Palestinians are the problem. They both want to get rid of each other. So, I mean, if you had a mature imperial power, that would be negotiable. But we don't. We have a power that is on one side, which means the side of ethnic cleansing and mass murder in Gaza.
All right. These are strong words, and I have to say, you know what, as I said, it's like we've learned a new lexicon of brutality. We do use these terms with much more meaning than we ever thought would have been possible in the modern world. Kai Bird, you actually have a slightly different perspective from a lot of what I read of our panelists today, because you have a child's perspective of crossing Mandelbaum Gate, of seeing what it is to be on both sides of the conflict, of dealing with real people on both sides. When you look back to what you saw as a child in Jerusalem and today, do you think things have changed forever after October 7th? A lot of people have that reaction when we speak about the issue.
I think my instinct is to say that October 7th has introduced a fundamental change. The Israelis can no longer believe that in security. The wall didn't protect them. The fences didn't protect them. And, you know, we've had episodes and wars and violence, but this attack, which was a war crime by Hamas, killing 1,200 innocents at a music festival, I mean, it was a war crime. But it also struck at the heart of Jewish sensibility everywhere, stemming from the Holocaust, the whole notion that never again. Well, this was a bloody, personal pogrom in the style of the pogroms of 19th century Russia. And, you know, it was hateful and barbaric.
But it's interesting that you're comparing them to something in Russia when most people would say it was a pogrom that compares to some of the things that were seen in, on the reverse.
Right. And so the response has been another war crime by the Israelis. And it's terrible. But I think it was so brutal, and it's such a shock to the sensibilities everywhere that maybe over time it's going to result in changes. For one thing, Bibi Netanyahu is not going to survive politically. This is the end of his political career. The next election, he will lose. And likewise, it's changing the politics about this issue in America. And of course, America controls the real cards. But I know I shouldn't go on too long, but so I am always the optimist. Because I think, dating back to my childhood years, I can see both sides, and I think there is a rational solution. It is two states. You know, one state 100 years from now, 200 years from now. But these people are so hateful of each other. So many war crimes have been inflicted on both sides that I don't think one state is a rational solution in the near term. Sure, theoretically, but there is a possibility for a two-state solution after this war ends if America would, and the international community would impose it. Call for an international peace conference in Geneva, insist on a referendum on a two-state solution in the West Bank and Gaza, or what remains of Gaza, and in Israel. And I think a two-state solution would win in such a referendum, and then the politicians would be forced to implement it.
All right, and you've kind of jumped the gun here because I was going to come to the various solutions, and I know that you have in your book the idea of the referendum as well, which I want to come to. But I do want to ask you, you know, your book is personal in so many ways. It speaks about your father, who's a diplomat there, and how he was affected, the work your parents still do in the 1980s, in their 80s. Your parents in their 80s still work on bringing some kind of understanding.
Yes, they were. They've both passed on now, but in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, they were both working on trying to bring peace to the Middle East.
Yeah. And you write, of course, most personally about your own son, who has grown up Jewish. But most importantly, you talk about almost like the two traumas that cannot be compared and cannot really find a middle ground in suffering, the Nakba and the Shoah, in the way that they are spoken about. Why is it that two peoples who have suffered so much from this kind of violence are not able to actually find empathy for each other? One of the things that I think changed after October 7th is it was possible to speak to people, even here in India, where, you know, with a little bit of distance, who could see the pain and feel, you know, terrible about the death of one child and not the other. Why is that so difficult?
Yeah, that's the problem. But there is a history, and the history matters. And there have been war after war, and a determination by the right-wing political forces in Israel to expand, as has been mentioned, to have more land. And the trauma has been, the ancient trauma that the Jewish Israelis feel in their gut is with them every day in present-day modern Israel. But they have imposed that kind of trauma on the Palestinians, who, dating back to to 48, and so the traumas feed on each other. But there, again, as the optimist, I want to remind people that there is a civil society on both sides. There are rational people. There is a middle-class intellectual community in Ramallah and likewise in Tel Aviv. And there could be dialogue. But, you know, the politicians who are enabling this conflict, and I speak as an American, that means mostly the politicians in Washington, you know, have got to become more realistic about this conflict.
And they have give voice to those constituencies.
It's very dangerous. This conflict, unlike Kashmir or
any whole new session opening up over here. So we'll leave that thing. I want to come to you, Charles Glass. You've written so much about the region that Israel is situated in, and you've traveled so much of it. You know, when I speak to Israeli officials, when I speak to Jewish Americans, one of the things they always say to me is, what else could have Israel done on October the 8th, as you pointed out? What else could they have done to not have responded to this kind of, as what you call personal kind of attack, would have been a sense of weakness in a region that does not respect weakness. Do you have an answer to that?
What region does respect weakness?
This is a fact. But to the question, what else could Israel have done on, you know, Thomas Friedman wrote this article, many in India didn't agree with him, where he actually said that the one country that has, in the face of such hatred and brutality, has chosen a different path was India after the Mumbai attacks. Didn't go to war, didn't strike Pakistan at the time. Many have questioned whether that was the right thing to do. But what is your answer to the question, what could Israel have done?
Well, Britain also, after many bombing attacks by the IRA on the British mainland, did not go and carpet bomb Northern Ireland. They dealt with it through negotiation and arresting IRA terrorists as they saw them. So there are ways of dealing with it that doesn't involve mass murder. And that is not the right reaction. And I mean, we were talking a minute about Israel's new sense of insecurity. I covered the October 1973 war. Okay, before October the 6th, 1973, Israel was sitting pretty. It had the whole Sinai. It had the Golan Heights so that the Assyrians' artillery could not overlook the Galilee. Along the Suez Canal was something called the impregnable Bar-Lev line. Israel was absolutely secure, and there was no incentive for Israel to negotiate the return of the Sinai and the Golan Heights or the West Bank, because the United States, and particularly Henry Kissinger, did not want them to, even though Sadat was making those offers at the time. So what happened on October the 6th was the Israeli army crossed the canal, and do you know how they brought down the impregnable Bar-Lev line? Water hoses. So the sand... That's what I did.
In fact, William, why aren't you on this stage?
Sorry,
for all of those who want a little more of the history, of course, William's Empire podcast.
Thank you. So the
the
Egyptian army used water cannon to bring down the sand, and they put pontoon bridges across, and they crossed into the Sinai, and Israel was in shock. Syrian tanks got into Israel itself across the 67 line. They were in shock then. They felt very insecure then. Ultimately, the government fell. There were great changes, but there was still no willingness to negotiate. There was still no willingness to discuss Palestine and the Palestinians, and that's still the case. Okay, they've had a shock, as they have a shock now, as in 1973. But as in 1973, they're not going to do anything about it.
And yet it was an Israeli negotiator, Abba Eban, who said, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, but so many opportunities have been missed on both sides. Navtej Sarna, you spent time as a diplomat there. One of the things that always comes to me when I think of Israel is the immense security one goes through over there, the immense, the idea of physical walls that are there between areas within a country, which is frightening. Do you think, when we go back now, and you've written about Indians at Herod's Gate, because you talk about a time when there's a confluence of religions in a sense. Do you think there is that sense of security can ever be achieved again?
Thank you, Suhasini. Before I come to that, may I just give a little addendum to what Charles said. I think Israel, after October 7, had a brief window. They had a window in which they would have had the sympathy of a lot of people. because of October 7th. And if they had gone about it, seeking revenge or attacking Hamas infrastructure and leaders in a targeted fashion, which the world expects on past performance them to be capable of, they may not have lost the information war, which they did recently. Unfortunately, I think because of the nature of the prevailing government in Israel, because of Netanyahu's own weakness and his desperation to survive with the support of the extreme right-wing coalition partners, he decided that this was the best way to go. And given the mood in Israel, which turned very ugly, I think this became the default. But they did have a window. Coming to your question, I think even in the days when I lived in Jerusalem and we walked the old streets of the old city, it was not that there was no security. There was security, and there was a sort of subterranean feeling of insecurity always, that anything can happen any time, particularly in East Jerusalem and that area. But as we have seen, that entire superstructure of security failed miserably. And a lot of the reason for that was that they were so preoccupied with what was happening in the West Bank, with the increased settlement activity and the clashes in the West Bank, that the Gaza fence was not well guarded enough. So I'm afraid, as far as Israel is concerned, they are simply going to double down on security. I think that is going to be, again, the first reaction. Double down, protect yourself doubly from everywhere, and, they will use every which way of increasing security. So I wouldn't go there, recommend a tourism holiday at the moment.
And of course, as it spreads regionally, the seeds of a possible different kind of conflict almost emerge and add to that instability. Antony Loewenstein, this session seems to have taken its name from your book, The Palestine Laboratory. It's a provocative it's a provocative book, in fact, if I may say. It leads you to ask a lot of questions. Another book I think you've written about Israel had someone referred to it as the J'accuse, of Emile Zola, where you are taking on, in a sense, your own people. You are taking on propaganda from both sides. I do want you to speak to the audience a little bit about what you try to bring out in the Palestine Laboratory, particularly given that you do have references to India. And I stop Charles right now from making that Kashmir reference. But your book actually does make the point about, an Indian diplomat using the idea of a Gaza solution as something that could be transported around the world. So tell me first what your book is about and how you see it in other parts of the world.
Let me just say one thing briefly before I do. One of the things that is so important to understand about this is Israeli Jews will never feel safe until Palestinians do. It is as simple as that. So, and the sad truth is that the whole so-called dream that Zionism was born around, which was Jews can never be safe in Europe, we need our own state in, as it turned out, in the Middle East, 100 years plus after Zionism was founded, it's to me inarguable that Zionism has made Jews, including me and others, more unsafe. We are not more safe with the establishment and presence of Israel. It's the opposite. My book is, some would call it provocative, some would call it fact-based, but I'll take J'accuse, that's okay. It is a global investigation how Israel uses the occupied Palestinian territories as a testing ground for new tools and technologies to repress Palestinians, drones, spyware, facial recognition technology, all those other kinds of tools. And over half a century, which is Israel, it's the longest occupation in modern times, Israel has used those tools to both control Palestinians, but also to sell them globally as so-called battle-tested. So you have huge amounts of nations, well over 130, so the majority of nations on this planet, who have used, bought, deployed some form of this repressive technology on their own people. And yes, the India-Israel relationship is worth mentioning briefly because traditionally India was not particularly close to Israel. With the new leadership here in the last decade, it's become far more so. And there's no doubt that India very much sees Israel as a model. And there have been huge amounts of...
I just cut in and say some Indians.
Some. I'm not saying every Indian person. I'm
When
saying...
you say India, it seems like an official position.
No, I'm talking about the Indian... I'm talking about elements of the Indian government. I'm not saying 1.5 billion people, to be clear. I mean the very many elements within the Indian political establishment and, frankly, media establishment who, over the last decade, have been highly I would say, not pro-Israel, but in their view, pro-Israel. So, as you said, you have leading Indian officials talking about what they want to do in Kashmir, being inspired by what Israel's doing in the West Bank. In other words, a permanent, inhumane, brutal occupation in Kashmir, which is frankly what's happening today as we speak, which would be inspired by what Israel is doing. Now, let me just finish, if I may, just briefly, is to say that although there are many other examples of what India and Israel are doing together, what Israel is doing is building an unofficial global coalition of kind of ethno-nationalist states. Nations that prioritise one people over another. Israel, of course, it's Jews. Here it's Hindus, and openly discriminating against those they don't like. Here it's Muslims, and in Israel it's also Palestinians and Muslims.
You know, my only problem is the comparisons, because I don't think you can compare two different situations.
They themselves admit that connection.
It doesn't matter. They may not be right.
But they are right.
So my question to you is, honestly, when you speak, even when you speak about the fact that it's the the Palestine laboratory, why is it not, for example, the Afghanistan laboratory? You know, because Israel is still the 10th largest defense supplier in the world. The US is much more.
Absolutely.
And does try out its thing. Anthony, I also do want to ask you a little bit about the idea of what you call politicide, the death of politics in a sense, that is brought about by the broad-based, sweeping ideas that seem prevalent in a country. What do you mean by that?
Politicide is a term that essentially means an attempted, I guess, killing of a people. So it was coined by Baruch Kimmeling, who's now the late Israeli philosopher. And essentially it talks about not necessarily killing everybody, and it means extinguishing the possibility of political aims, ambitions, or goals. And there's no doubt, despite the profound corruption and ineptitude of many Palestinian leaders, no one who's rational would say that elements of the Palestinian Authority who are deeply corrupt, backed by the West, I might add, or Hamas, are the best leaders Palestinians could have. But I think that politicide is a term and an idea that is deeply mainstream in Israel. I do disagree with what Kai has said, that of course there are Israeli Jews who are critical of what's going on. That's a given. But I'm sorry to say that that is a tiny, tiny, shrinking minority. What has happened within Israel in the last decades has, I would argue, been a quasi-takeover of Jewish supremacism. I'm not saying every Israeli Jew supports it. They don't. But that is the reality, that you have Jewish fascists, not just in government, but literally controlling the state. And frankly, Netanyahu could fall tomorrow. It makes no difference. The likely replacement is Benny Gantz, and I can assure you he's as much of a war criminal as Netanyahu.
Well, you've used very strong terms here. I'm going to leave it. Really, I do want to come back, if possible, to all of you to talk about the next step and the day after tomorrow, the day when the bombardment stops. There is a ceasefire. What's going to happen after that? But I'd like to honor this audience that's come out in such large numbers and are still standing by trying to take as many of the questions as possible. Can I see a show of hands? And would you mind getting to the lady right up front? Sorry.
Can I just say with questions, because it's such a crowd, you need to get a microphone. There are three at the front.
Yeah, please don't speak without the microphone.
There are three at the front. No, they have to speak to a microphone because it's being internationally live streamed and nobody will hear the question. So please, bear with us. People who can reach a microphone, I have three colleagues with microphones at the front. Questions should go from them. Thank you.
Hi. I just want to ask that we have seen this conflict playing out for the past 4 months or so, and the stance that the other actors in this conflict, America, Britain, have had the stance hasn't changed. Even after the huge protests, even after when ICJ has accepted South Africa's case, even when journalists ask Antony Blinken, or even when in British Parliament, the officials are questioned that, do you think it is a war crime? Do you think Israel is committing war crimes? And they start stuttering, maybe,
And your question is?
Yeah. How long can it be like that? How long can they avoid
Before
these
the
questions?
rest of the global audience. Thank you. Why don't we try and get the gentleman there? And
is it on? Yeah, this question is specifically for you, Anthony. You did mention a word about Hamas. I remember reading that Hamas, in fact, was a creation of the Israeli Mossad.
right. And the idea that Prime Minister Netanyahu actually allowed certain tranches to move through Qatar. The lady here?
Hi. I was wondering with the reaction of the West, and then we've seen, ICJ, what happened, South Africa. So there seems to be a polarization amongst countries now. So when we are talking about a solution for later, who's going to be able to broker that?
When everyone is partisan in a certain sense. I think there's a gentleman at the back with his, okay, there's a gentleman just behind.
So actually I just don't have a question. I just want to remind everyone something. That وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرَ اللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. You tried in Afghanistan, you tried in Libya, Taliban came back, you are trying in Kashmir, you are trying in Israel, but it is indeed Allah who plans the best. It is indeed Allah who plans the best, and indeed Palestine will be free.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, do you feel you would be able to give this talk in the US or the UK?
And would you get this audience? Okay. I can see a lot of hands up, and I'm really sorry, but I need to go back to my panel just now. You get a sense of the mood in the room. I want to come back to each of you one by one and give you time not only to respond to some of the specific questions you've been asked, but also to that other question. What happens day after tomorrow? When the guns go silent for right now, who's going to do the reconstruction? How are we going to take a step forward? Is there ever going to be a peace process again? Kai, would you like to open?
Yes. The day after is really most important. I mean, we can debate the history, we can debate who is a bigger war criminal, but again, this can't go on. It's impractical. The military campaign in Gaza does not have a real military goal that is achievable. It's not real. It's a revenge war. It's insanity. So the day after, there is going to be, again, trying to make an optimistic case for a hopeless neighborhood. There could be a realization that we need to have new rules and a complete change. And we could, we realize in America that this is a very dangerous conflict that has the potential. I'm thinking of Oppenheimer again, because Oppenheimer things are on my mind, but this has the potential for a nuclear disaster, the use of a dirty bomb. It is really dangerous. And on that basis, you could make an argument, even in America, and opinion is changing in America these days, in the Jewish community and elsewhere. And we could, decide we've got to impose a solution. And finally, I just want to make one plea. In my book, Crossing Mandelbaum Gate, I came up with what I thought was always a brilliant solution for the question of identity. And I think identity is the problem of this conflict. The Israelis have never identified what their boundaries are. They don't have a constitution. They don't have a definition for who is an Israeli and who is not. They need to have a new identity based on secular, the notion of that they have created a new national identity. They're Israelis. They're not Jews. in the first place. It's not a Jewish state. It's an Israeli state. And the whole point of Zionism was to create a state like any other state, and that should be their goal today. And under a Hebrew republic as such, drenched in Jewish culture and Hebrew language, but secular and I hope living side by side with a Palestinian state, then there's a chance for dialogue and reciprocity.
And then the seeds of this Hebrew Republic you speak about much more in your book. So I would in fact encourage everyone to read all of the books our authors have written today because they give you a holistic view. Charles, you used the word, sort of a revenge killing, a kind of tribal thing almost, in the day after. Would you say that Israel has wreaked its revenge for the October 7th attack, and so therefore there is a hope for the day after?
Well, this term, the day after, comes up again and again, and it's always put in these terms: what will Israel do with Gaza on the day after? The question is never asked, what do the Palestinians want? What is their right to self-determination? It's always what Israel and the United States will decide the day after. By the way, also, I don't believe there is a day after coming. This will go on and on. Even if the overwhelming military operation ceases, the conflict will go on. Until this whole thing is resolved, the conflict goes on. So there is no last day for which there could be a day after.
All right. Navtej, the lady here did ask the question about what about the other players? What are they doing? And I do want to add in there, how about India? I can't really tell. Antony did portray India's position a little bit, but it's a little bit of a tightrope, isn't it? We are, talk about zero tolerance to terrorism when we defer to October 7th, yet India has not, the government has not banned Hamas as a terror organization. We speak about our empathy for the Palestinian people and, we're trying to send aid and all the rest, yet we're also gearing up 50 to 60,000 Indians to take their jobs. In Israel as we speak. We speak about the idea of the two-state solution, and yet we are not directly asking Israel for a ceasefire. We have been part of the UNGA resolution or the non-alignment. So where does India stand in this, and can it take up the role that the US and the UK have so clearly abdicated?
There's a famous book, what is it? Somebody rushes in where angels fear to tread. Yeah. So I think we should be very careful. This is a very complex game. And if it's a game, because frankly, before I come to your specifics, I don't see a day after. At the moment, all you can see is a very long night. Because what's going to happen, even if the bombing stops, there's no way that Israel is going to say we are not completely going to control Gaza. There's no way that they're going to say we are going to pour in millions of dollars and rebuild what was destroyed. And there's no way that free humanitarian aid and UN workers, etc., are going to be able to go in. So it's going to be a long, long wait before any sort of normalcy returns for the Palestinians and the people who have been displaced. It's going to be a long, long time before Israel can muster up enough security in its changed mindset to say we can have the openings for dialogue. And the only people who can play it at this, and this is where I come to your specific question and the lady's question out there, is if the United States changes its policy dramatically and gets a buy-in from the Arab neighbors of Israel. And that is the only way that they can come to a composite solution. Because what October 7 has done is that the Palestinian problem is now squarely on the table. It is not under the carpet. It has to be addressed.
And there's no
normalization. And only then will you get anywhere, and only then will the rest of the world, including India, be able to play a meaningful role and contribute in whatever small manner we can.
They can. Antony, you can see the clock is ticking, and you've still got to answer the gentleman there about the Israeli support, perhaps to Doha's funding or whatever, as well as I think the gentleman who asked, will you get this audience anywhere else, and could you say this anywhere else?
I've got 56 seconds. Hamas, yes, Israel had some involvement initially, and certainly Netanyahu was undeniably involved, as you said. And this has been reported in essentially allowing huge amounts of money to come in to support Hamas in the last years. But finally, the only thing to me that will bring some kind of change is a degree of accountability for actions. Until we have an Israeli official, a military figure, on trial for war crimes, and for that matter, American officials for Iraq and Afghanistan. This is not just about Israel, Palestine. Until the vast parts of the global south realise that the so-called West, whatever that means, basically Washington, is serious about accountability, that's the only way. Accountability for crimes. Where is that happening? The ICJ is a beginning, and good on South Africa for doing that, but in general, this needs to be the beginning of that. And that's 000 time.
Thank you. You've been a great panel and a wonderful audience.